Hey everybody, welcome back to the LearnAP Calc series. Today we're going to talk about how to take derivatives. So a quick review of derivatives, the power rule, product rule, quotient rule, chain rule, and then we're also going to talk about derivatives of trig functions, exponentials, logarithms, and the inverse trig functions derivatives. Be sure to leave a comment if you're confused on anything in the video, or you can also ask in the weekly live streams we do every Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, where we answer your questions about AP Calc. So without further ado, we'll get started. Alright, so before I get into how to take derivatives, let's just walk through a quick review of derivatives, which we covered in the last video. A derivative can be thought of in two ways, so a derivative being the slope of a function, and it can also be thought of as the rate of change of the function. So you can think about it in these two ways, but this is what a derivative is. If this is sort of confusing to you, go ahead and click over to the last video where I talked about this in more depth. Alright, so the first way to take a derivative is the power rule. So if we have a function f of x, we don't need to use the limit definition to find its derivative every time. The easiest way is to use the power rule, which says that if we have a function of x equaling x to the n, its derivative is n times x to the n minus 1. So for example, x cubed, all I'm going to do is take this cube, multiply it out in the front, and take this exponent minus 1, 3x squared. Very simple. So like, again, x to the 5th, 5x to the 4th, n x to the n minus 1. Alright, so you can't always use the power rule. So what if we have two terms multiplying each other and we want to take the derivative? So a good way would be to use the product rule, which says that if we have some function h of x equaling some function f of x times g of x, the derivative is equal to the derivative of f of x times g of x plus f of x times the derivative of g of x. So what this would look like is if we have an example, f of x equaling x to the 5th plus x to the 7th plus 9x squared times the quantity 8x to the 8th plus 2x cubed plus x. We could use the power rule, but I don't really want to multiply all this stuff out. So what we can do is use the product rule. So here we have some function times another function. So all I have to do is the product rule. So the derivative of f of x would just be the derivative of this first term right here, 5x to the 4th plus 7x to the 6th plus 18x times this term, which is just 8x to the 8th plus 2x cubed plus x, plus the first term, x to the 5th plus x to the 7th plus 9x squared times the derivative of the second term, which here is 64x to the 7th plus 6x squared plus x. And so all we're doing here is f prime of x times g of x plus f of x times g prime of x. So that's all the product rule is. Alright, now let's talk about the quotient rule. If you have a fraction of terms and you need to take a derivative, you can use the quotient rule. Now the quotient rule says that given h of x equaling f of x over g of x, the derivative of h of x is the derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top all over the bottom squared. So that's sort of an easy way to think about the quotient rule. If you try to memorize this, it's not really the easiest thing to memorize, but just thinking about derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top all over the bottom squared is sort of an easier way of memorizing the quotient rule. So let's say that we had h of x equaling x to the 5th over sine of x. And I wanted to find h prime of x. Again, the derivative of the top, 5x to the fourth, times the bottom, sine of x, minus the derivative of the bottom. We're going to talk about this later, but the derivative of sine is cosine, times the top, which is just x to the fifth, all over the bottom squared, so sine squared x. So that's all the quotient rule is. The derivative of the top times the bottom minus the derivative of the bottom times the top all over the bottom squared. Alright, now let's talk about something a little more obscure, the chain rule. The chain rule is very important that you know it. Now, given that h of x equals some function of g of x, so f of g of x in this case, the derivative is f prime of g of x times g prime of x. So this looks sort of icky, but I can show you some ways in which the chain rule is very useful. So find f of x if f of x equals x minus 5 to the 11th power. Now you could use the product rule if you multiply this all out, but that's probably not the easiest way of doing this. You should just use the chain rule. So again, we have f of x here equaling f, I'll just call this h of x equaling f of g of x. And that shows up here. So I know that my derivative is f prime of g of x times g prime of x. So what would that look like? So f prime of g of x, I'm just taking the derivative of this. So I'm just going to multiply by 11 and then take this all to the 10th power. Simple enough. Now the chain rule says multiply by the derivative of the inside, or g of x, which is x minus 5. The derivative of that is 1, so I find that my derivative is simply 11 times x minus 5 to the 10th. Now if you think about it, the power rule is just a special case of the chain rule. When we do the power rule, like say x to the fifth dy dx, I'll just call it d dx equals 5x to the fourth. This is just a special extension of the chain rule because we know that this inside term, g prime of x, always equals 1. So again, very important that you know the chain rule, sort of understand it. Very fundamental to taking derivatives. Alright, so now let's talk about some derivatives you need to know. So note that these u's here are just some function. So this could be like x squared, or it could be sine of x, it can be anything. And that in all these cases we're essentially multiplying by u prime as a result of the chain rule. So we remember that f of x equals g of h of x, then f prime of x equals g prime of h of x times h prime of x. So this u prime is a result of this. So you essentially need to know all these for the AP test, so just memorize them. And these are the derivative of sine is cosine, the derivative of cosine is negative sine, the derivative of tan is secant squared, the derivative of log base a of u is u prime of u over u times ln of a. And we have a special case where the derivative of ln of x, or I'll just say u here to make it more general, is u prime of u over u, because our a here is e, ln of e is just 1. I'll keep that there. But if you know this, then you know this. Similarly, a to the u is u prime times ln of a times a to the u. And so you might have seen that the derivative of e to the x is just e to the x. And again, this is just a special case of this. The derivative of secant is secant x tan x. The derivative of cosecant is cosecant x cotangent x. And the derivative of cotangent is cosecant squared. And so you can kind of see that these cos go with each other. So that might be a good technique to memorize these, but in general you just have to know these for the AP test. Just have to memorize them. Alright, so let's talk about inverse trig derivatives. You might not need to know these for the time being just because these tend to come up later in your AP course, but these will be on the AP test. That being said, if you don't want to memorize these now, you can just sort of forget about them and then memorize them when they come up in your class. But I just figured I'd show you and sort of give you the option. Note that you actually don't have to memorize these. You can derive them yourself if you forget, but that takes too long. So for the AP test, I would recommend to memorize all of these right here. Alright, so let's do a quick practice problem. Find the derivative of sine of the logarithm of x squared. So pause your video, unpause when you think you found the answer. Alright, so for this one, we're actually going to have to do the chain rule twice. So f of x equals g of h of x. So f prime of x equals g prime of h of x times h prime of x. So let's write this out. F prime of x equals g prime of h of x. So the derivative of sine, and then just put this in whatever we get. The derivative of sine is cosine. So cosine of h of x, which here is log of x squared. Alright, and now we need h prime of x. Now, just from knowing the formulas that I showed you, we can just simply say that this is going to be 2x over ln of 10 times x squared. But if you didn't know that, you would have to use the chain rule again, where you basically say h of x equals, I'll just say like z of t of x, and that h prime of x equals z prime t of x times t prime of x. And then I would say, okay, h prime of x equals the derivative of logarithm, which is just 1 over ln of 10 times whatever I had inside, which is x squared, times the derivative of t of x, which here is 2x. So if you didn't know, if you knew that ln of x equals 1 over x, but you didn't know the general one, you would have to do the chain rule again. But if you did know it, you could just write out h prime of x right away. Alright, so that brings me to today's challenge problem. Find the derivative of 5e to the 5x times cosine squared x. The solution is on our website, learn-ap.com, and I'll also put a direct link in the description. If you guys found this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for future content. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter for updates about our new videos and live streams, which we do every Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, where we answer your questions about AP Calc. So if you're confused about anything, be sure to check out those live streams. Links for that stuff will also be in the description. Leave a comment on the video if you're confused about anything, or also just any other comments on the video in general. Other than that, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.